the title of the series of lectures this year is God Created the World With, and then we finish it out. This month, God created the world with creatures of the skies and seas. And here, because we want to cross every T and dot every I, every photograph that we use is given full credit appropriately. Every statement that is made that I didn't write personally or one of my colleagues didn't write, if it is published by others, we cite it specifically for accuracy and for honesty. I think we ought to be accurate and honest, don't you?
Amen.
All right. Now, introduction. The interrelationship of Earth. Now, that's an entire lecture. Let's hope I get beyond that. Everything is interrelated together. I talked to the group upstairs about the pitch for the ark and about the word having to do with gopher wood. It turns out that the word for gopher there it means in the Hebrew to house in. It's an engineering technique. So when we put it together, every component of the structure of the ark was housed together with pitch. What kind of pitch was it? Can you listen real fast? Most people say, well, it was tar. It was asphalt. Well, now, wait a minute. Asphalt is post-flood, even though it came from the bowels of the earth. It's carbon with 32 molecules, and that's not enough that's not small enough, nanotechnology enough, to penetrate the pores that we need. Did you know, if you Google superglue and Neanderthal, you find that the Neanderthals invented superglue. They used birch bark resin. They heated it specifically. You can check all of this out. Just Google Neanderthals superglue. They used birch bark resin. They had to heat it anaerobically. What does that mean? Without air, without oxygen, without free oxygen coming in. Had to heat it anaerobically. They had to heat it between 645 and 725 degrees Fahrenheit. You engineers listening very closely? If they don't heat it to 645, it won't catalyze. That is, the molecules won't break apart. If they heat it beyond 725, it won't polymerize. That is, as they break apart, they won't form new structures of the resin. And the resin, of course, is biological. You have to heat it, they had to heat it to at least 645, but not above 725 degrees Fahrenheit. And under those conditions, it forms a gum. And as it is cooling, they had a problem. Their spear shafts and their spear points kept breaking. And of course, they used the American Indian technique of tying it with leather strips, but it just kept breaking. So they devised an ingenious method. They took birch bark resin, birch bark, distilled it into resin at those particular degrees anaerobically. It became a gum. As it was cooling, they could daub, and every single crevice, tiny micro crevice in the spear shaft was penetrated, and every single crevice, even in the chert or flint rock, was penetrated so that it never broke. If anything broke, it was the spear shaft or the spear point, not the hafted joint. They invented superglue. By the way, they invented shopping centers. That's recognized. They drew beautiful artistry. They invented jewelry. They invented cinema, the movie. I mean, check me out on this. The Neanderthals, some smart guy or girl, took a disc about that big, had a hole in it because they'd already invented, or at least are given credit for, having invented a loom system to weave clothing. And some of their artistry, the Magdalenian woman, check all of this out. The Magdalenian woman is shown with a hat, a tam, jewelry, a jacket, slippers. Wow, they were very intelligent. By the way, our cranial capacity is 1,350 cc's. Theirs is 1,450 cc's. And Cro-Magnon man was 1,650 cc's. We're not the best that ever was. So there was a hole in it. So somebody carved a deer standing in a meadow in the grass. And they turned it diagonally, they turned it opposite direction, 180 degrees. On the other side, drew the same deer with the grass, but his legs were in the air. You run a leather strip through that, you twine it, you pull it like that, and the deer is running through the meadow. They invented animation, the cinema, the movies. But back to the birch bark resin. So they used birch bark resin, and it worked. So they're given credit for inventing it. They kept all of that wood laminated together with the pitch. And the pitch was organic. It was resin. Birch bark resin is different from birch core resin. Birch bark resin is remedial. The birches and the willows are known as remedial trees. That is, if you have contamination, if you have a lot of metal in the soil, if you have contamination, even radioactivity, they plant birch and willows and they will uptake the radioactivity and the metal. Check it all out. Wow. Now, just suppose Noah and his family knew husbandry pretty well, horticulture pretty well. They did. When you live that long, you've got to learn something. And they had all their brain capacity. By the way, we lose half, we end up with 100 billion brain cells. Genetically, we produce 200 billion brain cells. We lose half of them in the third trimester because of the lack of oxygen. With that additional hyperbaric oxygen in the pre-flood context, you wouldn't lose the brain cells because there are millions of new brain cells generated every day during the third trimester. 200 billion brain cells are generated overall. We end up with 100 billion brain cells because half of them didn't have enough oxygen to keep going. So how many knew we were only playing with half a deck anyhow? Yeah. In 6 to 10 minutes of oxygen deprivation, a brain cell dies. But the designer designed a plumbing system. Aren't you glad those dead brain cells are not rattling around in your cranium? There's a plumbing system to get rid of all that. But also, aren't you glad? Remember, mothers, you mothers know a lot of things we men just never take time to know. Remember the soft spot on the little kid? Yeah, you have to be real sure, be real careful about that soft spot. Because the 7 basic sutures of the cranium don't find their final form until later. So there is the ability for the head to be larger or to be smaller. It depends on how many brain cells are left. Wow, so no wonder those closer to creation, closer to the flood, no wonder they were smarter than we are. So those smart Neanderthals with a cranial capacity larger than ours to begin with, and they were closer to creation, didn't have as much damage as we have, no wonder they were so smart.